Good morning. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Hump day. I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Storytime. And we are back with more War and Peace. If you've been here before, you'll know the drill. If not, welcome. You can catch up. I have a playlist on my channel that has all the readings up until now, so you can catch up. We are in Volume 3, Part 1, Section. We're going to read 4, 5, and 6 this morning really quickly. And we're picking up in 1812 as Napoleon is invading Russia. So let's just jump in. On the 14th of June at 2 o'clock in the morning, the sovereign, having summoned Balashov and read him his letter to Napoleon, ordered him to carry this letter and hand it personally to the French emperor. Sending Balashov on his way, the sovereign again repeated to him the words that he would not make peace so long as even one armed enemy remained on Russian soil, and ordered him to convey these words to Napoleon without fail. The sovereign did not include them in the letter because he felt, with his innate tact, that it would be inappropriate to convey these words at the moment when a last attempt at reconciliation was being made, but he told Balashov to convey them without fail to Napoleon in person. Having set out that same night, accompanied by a bugler and 2 Cossacks, Balashov reached the French outpost of the village of Rakonki on the Russian side of the Niemen. At dawn, he was stopped by French cavalry sentinels. A French hussar under-officer in a raspberry-colored uniform and shaggy hat shouted to the approaching Balashov, ordering him to stop. Balashov did not stop at once, but went on moving slowly down the road. The under-officer, frowning and muttering some abuse, thrust his horse breast towards Balashov, took a hold of his saber, and shouted rudely at the Russian general, asking him if he was deaf and had not heard what he was told. Balashov gave his name. The under-officer sent a soldier for an officer. Paying no attention to Balashov, the under-officer started talking with his comrades about regimental matters and did not glance at the Russian general. It was extremely strange for Balashov, after his closeness to the highest power and might, after his conversation 3 hours earlier with the sovereign, and generally in the habit of being honored in his service, to see here, on Russian soil, this hostile and above all disrespectful treatment of him by brute force. The sun was just beginning to rise behind the clouds. The air was fresh and dewy. A herd of cattle was being driven down the road from the village. From the fields, one by one, trilling larks sprayed up like bubbles in water. Balashov looked around him, awaiting the arrival of the officer from the village. The Russian Cossacks, the bugler, and the French hussars silently glanced at each other now and then. A French hussar colonel, obviously just out of bed, came riding from the village on a handsome, well-fed gray horse, accompanied by 2 hussars. The officer, the soldiers, and their horses had a contented and foppish look. This was that initial period of a campaign when the troops still find themselves in good order, almost on the level of a peacetime review of maneuvers, only with a tingle of warlike showiness in their dress, and with a moral tinge of that gaiety and enthusiasm that always accompany the beginning of a campaign. The French colonel had a hard time stifling his yawns, but was courteous and evidently realized the full significance of Balashov. He led him past his soldiers behind the line and informed him that his wish to be presented to the emperor would probably be fulfilled at once, because, as far as he knew, the emperor's quarters were close by. They rode through the village of Rakonki, past the French hussar tethering posts, sentinels, and soldiers, who saluted their colonel and looked with curiosity at the Russian uniform, and came out on the other side of the village. According to the colonel, they were 1.5 miles from the commander of the division, who would receive Balashov and take him to his destination. The sun had already risen and shone gaily on the bright greenery. They had just ridden up a hill past a tavern when a bunch of horsemen appeared, riding towards them from the foot of the hill, at the head of whom, on a black horse, its trappings gleaming in the sun, rode a tall man in a plumed hat, with black curled, shoulder-length hair and a red mantle, his long legs thrust forward as Frenchmen ride. This man galloped to meet Balashov, his plumes flying, his jewels and gold galloons shining in the bright June sun. Balashov was just 2 lengths away from the horseman riding to meet him, with a theatrical, solemn face, in bracelets, plumes, necklaces, and gold, when Ulner, the French colonel, whispered respectfully, "Le Roi de Naples." Indeed, it was Murat, who was now called the Neapolitan king. Though it was completely incomprehensible why he was the Neapolitan king, he was called that, and he was fully convinced of it himself, and therefore had still a more solemn and important air than before. He was so sure that he was indeed the Neapolitan king that when, on the eve of his departure from Naples, while strolling with his wife through the streets of the city, several Italians had cried, "Vive il re!" He had turned to his wife and with a sad smile said, "Les malheureux, ils ne savent pas que je les quitte demain." But though he firmly believed that he was the Neapolitan king and was sorry for the grief of his subjects that he was abandoning, lately, after being called back in his service, and especially after meeting Napoleon in Danzig, when his august brother-in-law had said to him, "Je veux il faire roi pour régner à ma manière, mais pas la vôtre," he had cheerfully taken up his familiar business and, as a well-fed but not yet fat horse, still fit for work, feeling itself in harness, begins to frolic in the shafts, he, having dressed up as gaudily and expensively as possible, cheerful and content, went riding down the roads of Poland, not knowing where or why himself. Seeing the Russian general, he threw back his head with its curled, shoulder-length hair in a kingly manner and gave the French colonel a questioning glance. The colonel deferentially conveyed to His Majesty the meaning of Balashov, whose family name he could not pronounce. "De Malmachave," said the king, overcoming by his resoluteness the difficulty with that the colonel was faced with. "Jamais de faire votre connaissance, General," he added, with a gesture of kindly graciousness. As soon as the king began to speak loudly and quickly, all his kingly dignity instantly left him, and not noticing it himself, he went over to his proper tone of good-natured familiarity. He placed his hand on the withers of Balashov's horse. "Eh bien, General, tout est la guerre à ce qu'il peut faire," he said, as if regretting the circumstance of which he could not judge. "Sire," replied Balashov, "l'empereur mon maître ne désirait point la guerre, et comme votre majesté le voit," said Balashov, using votre majesté as at every turn, with inevitable affected frequency, addressing the person for whom this title was still a novelty. Marat's face beamed with stupid satisfaction as he listened to Monsieur de Balashov, but royalty obligée, he felt it necessary to discuss state affairs with Alexander's envoy as a king and ally. He dismounted and, taking Balashov by the arm and moving a few steps away from the suite, who waited respectfully, began walking up and down with him, trying to speak significantly. He mentioned that the Emperor Napoleon was offended by the demand to withdraw his troops from Prussia, especially now when the demand had become known to everyone and the dignity of France was offended by it. Balashov said that there was nothing offensive in this demand because Marat interrupted him. "So you don't consider the Emperor Alexander the instigator?" he said unexpectedly with a good-naturedly stupid smile. Balashov told him why he actually supposed that the initiator of the war was Napoleon. "Eh, mon cher général," Marat interrupted him, "je désirais de tout mon cœur que l'empereur se arrangement entre ex et que la guerre commence malgré moi se termine le plus tôt possible," he said in the tone of a conversation between servants who wished to remain good friends despite a quarrel between their masters. And he went on to ask about the Grand Duke, about his health, and to reminisce about the gay and amusing time he had spent with him in Naples. Then, as if suddenly recollecting his royal dignity, Marat straightened up solemnly, assumed the same pose he had at his coronation, and with a wave of the right hand said, "Je ne vous retiens plus, Général. Je serai le succès de votre mission." And his embroidered red mantle and plumes flying, and his precious stones glimmering, he went towards the suite that was respectfully waiting for him. Balashov rode off, supposing from Marat's words that he would quite soon be introduced to Napoleon himself, but instead of meeting Napoleon soon, he was detained by sentinels of Davout's infantry corps at the next village, as he had been at the front line, and the summoned adjutant of the corps commander took him to the village to Marshal Davout. Section 5. Davout was the Emperor Napoleon's arch-chief, a non-cowardly arch-chief, but equally efficient, cruel, and incapable of expressing his devotion otherwise than by cruelty. In the mechanism of the state organization, these people are necessary, as wolves are necessary in nature's organism, and they always exist, always appear, and hold out, however incongruous their presence and closeness to the head of the government may seem. Only this necessity can explain how the cruel arch-chief, who personally tore out grenadiers' mustaches, whose nerves were too weak for him to endure danger, an uneducated and uncourtly man could hold on to such power next to the chivalrously noble and gentle character of Alexander. Belashov found Marshal Davout in the shed of a peasant cottage, sitting on a barrel and busy with written work. He was checking the accounts. An adjutant stood next to him. It would have been possible to find a better location, but Marshal Davout was one of those people who deliberately set themselves up in the most gloomy conditions of life, so as to have the right to be gloomy. For the same reason, they are always in a hurry and stubbornly busy. How can I think about the happy side of human life when, as you see, I am sitting on a barrel in a dirty shed and working? Said the expression of his face. The chief pleasure and need of these people, on meeting life's animation, consists in throwing their gloomy, stubborn activity into the eyes of that animation. Davout allowed himself this pleasure when seeing Balashov was brought to him. He immersed himself still more in his work when the Russian general came in and looked through his spectacles at Balashov's face, animated by the impression of the beautiful morning and the conversation with Marat. He did not stand up, did not even stir, but frowned still more and grinned spitefully. Noticing on Balashov's face the unpleasant expression produced by this reception, Davout raised his head and coldly asked what he wanted. Supposing that such a reception could be given him only because Davout did not know that he was Emperor Alexander's adjutant general and even his representative before Napoleon, Balashov hastened to inform him of his rank and purpose. Contrary to his expectation, Davout, having heard Balashov out, he became still more stern and rude. "Where's your packet?" he said. "Donnez-le-moi. Je l'envoie à l'empereur." Balashov said that he was under orders to personally deliver the packet to the emperor. "Your emperor's orders are carried out in your army, but here," said Davout, "you should do as you're told." And as if to let the Russian general feel still more his dependence on brute force, Davout said his adjutant for the officer on duty. Balashov took out the packet that contained the sovereign's letter and placed it on the table, a table consisting of a door ripped off its hinges, sticking out from it laid over 2 barrels. Davout took the envelope and read what was written on it. "You are perfectly within your rights to show or not show respect for me," said Balashov, "but allow me to observe that I have the honor to bear the rank of His Majesty's Adjutant General." Davout looked at him silently, and the slight trouble and confusion expressed on Balashov's face clearly afforded him pleasure. "You'll be rendered what's due to you," he said, and putting the envelope in his pocket, he left the shed. A minute later, the marshal's adjutant, Monsieur de Castres, came in and led Balashov to the lodgings prepared for him. Balashov had dinner with the marshal that day in the same shed, on the same board on barrels. The next day, Davout left early in the morning and, summoning Balashov, told him imposingly that he asked him to remain there, to move along with the baggage if such were the orders, and to speak with no one except Monsieur de Castres, as, after 4 days of solitude, boredom, and consciousness of his dependence and insignificance, felt especially sharply after the milieu of power in which he had been so recently. After several marches with the marshal's baggage and the French troops which occupied the entire area, Balashov was brought to Villeneuve, now occupied by the French, through the same gate from which he had ridden out 4 days earlier. The next day, the emperor's gentleman-in-waiting, Monsieur de Turenne, came to Balashov and conveyed to him the Emperor Napoleon's wish to honor him with an audience. 4 days earlier, the sentinels at Preobrazhensky of the Preobrazhensky regiment were standing by the house to which Balashov was brought. Now 2 French grenadiers stood there, in blue uniforms open on the chest and shaggy hats. A convoy of hussars and uhlans, and a dazzling suite of adjutants, pages, and generals, expecting Napoleon to come out, waited by the porch near his saddle horse and his Mamluke Rustam. Napoleon was to receive Balashov in the same house in Villeneuve from which Alexander had sent him off. Oy vey. Section 6. Accustomed though Balashov was to court solemnity, the luxury and magnificence of the Emperor Napoleon's court struck him. Count Turenne led him into a large reception room in which sat many generals, gentlemen-in-waiting, and Polish dignitaries, many of whom Balashov had seen at the court of the Russian emperor. Duroc said that the Emperor Napoleon would receive the Russian general before his promenade. After several minutes of expectation, the gentleman-in-waiting on duty that came out to the large reception room, and with a courteous bow to Balashov, invited him to follow him. Balashov went into a small reception room. From which there came one door to the study, from which there was one door to the study, the same study from which the Russian emperor had sent him off. Balashov stood alone for a couple of minutes. There was the sound of hurried footsteps behind the door. Both halves of the door opened quickly. The gentleman waiting who opened them stopped respectfully. Everything fell silent, and from the study came the sound of another firm, resolute step. This was Napoleon. He had just finished dressing for his ride. He was in a dark blue uniform, open over a white waistcoat, which went down over his round stomach. White buckskin stretched tight over the fat haunches of his short legs, and jack boots. His short hair had obviously just been brushed, but one strand hung loose over the middle of his wide forehead. His plump, white neck stood out sharply against the black collar of his uniform. He smelled of cologne. His full, youthful face with its protruding chin bore an expression of graciousness and majestic imperial breeding. He came out, springing briskly at every step, his head slightly thrown back. The whole of his stout, short figure, with its broad, fat shoulders and involuntarily thrust-out stomach and chest, had that imposing, stately look which pampered 40-year-old men have. Beside, it was clear that he was in very good spirits that day. He nodded in response to Balashöv's low and respectful bow, and going up to him, began speaking at once like a man who values every minute of his time and who does not condescend to prepare his speeches, but is certain that he will always speak well and say what needs to be said. "Good day, General," he said. "I have received the Emperor Alexander's letter, which you delivered, and am very glad to see you." He glanced into Balashöv's face with his large eyes, and at once began to look straight ahead past him. It was obvious that Balashöv's person did not interest him in the least. It was clear that only what was on his soul was of interest to him. Everything that was outside of him had no meaning for him, because everything in the world, as it seemed to him, depended upon his will. "I do not want and have never wanted war," he said, "but I was forced into it even now." He emphasized that word. "I am prepared to accept all the explanations you can give me." And he began to lay out, clearly and briefly, the reasons for his displeasure with the Russian government. Judging by the calmly moderate and friendly tone with which the French emperor spoke, Balashöv was firmly convinced that he wanted peace and intended to enter into negotiations. "Sire, l'Empereur mon maître," Balashöv began his long-prepared speech, when Napoleon, having finished his own speech, looked questioningly at the Russian envoy, but the gaze of the emperor's eyes directed at him confused him. "You're confused. Pull yourself together," Napoleon seemed to be saying to him, looking over Balashöv's uniform and saber with a barely perceptible smile. Balashöv pulled himself together and began to speak. He said that the Emperor Alexander did not consider Kuragин's demand for passports a sufficient reason for starting a war, that Kuragin had acted thus by his own free will and without the consent of the sovereign, that the Emperor Alexander did not want war, and that there were no relations with England. "Not yet," Napoleon put in, and as if afraid of giving way to his emotions, he frowned and inclined his head slightly, thereby letting Balashöv feel that he could go on. Having spoken out everything he had been ordered to, Balashöv said that the Emperor Alexander wanted peace, but would not enter into negotiations otherwise than on the condition that— Here Balashöv hesitated. He remembered the words that the Emperor Alexander had not written in the letter, but which he had ordered to be inserted without fail in the rescript to Saltykov, and which he had ordered Balashöv to convey to Napoleon. Balashöv remembered the words, "Not a single armed enemy remains on Russian soil," but some complex feeling held him back. He could not say these words, though he wanted to. He hesitated and said, "On the condition that French troops withdraw beyond the Niemen." Napoleon noticed Balashöv's confusion as he uttered these last words. His face twitched. His left calf began to tremble rhythmically. Without leaving his place, he began to speak in a higher and more hurried voice than before. During the speech that followed, Balashöv, lowering his eyes more than once, involuntarily observed the trembling of Napoleon's left calf, which increased as he raised his voice. "I want peace no less than the Emperor Alexander," he began. "Have I not been doing everything during these 18 months to obtain it? I have waited 18 months for explanations. And what is demanded of me in order to start negotiations?" he said, frowning and making an energetically questioning gesture with his small, white, plump hand. "The withdrawal of your troops beyond the Niemen, sire," said Balashöv. "Beyond the Niemen?" Napoleon repeated. "So now you want me to withdraw beyond the Niemen, merely the Niemen?" Napoleon repeated, looking straight at Balashöv. Balashöv lowered his head respectfully. Instead of the demand 4 months earlier that he withdraw from Pomerania, now they demanded only that he withdraw beyond the Niemen. Napoleon turned quickly and started pacing the room. "You say that withdrawal beyond the Niemen is demanded of me in order to begin negotiations, but in just the same way it was demanded of me 2 months ago that I withdraw beyond the Oder and the Vistula. And despite that, you agreed to conduct negotiations. He paced silently from one corner of the room to the other and again stopped in front of Balashov. His face was as if petrified in its stern expression, and his left leg trembled still more rapidly than before. Napoleon knew that he had this trembling of the left calf. Le vibration de mon mollet gauche est un grand signe chez moi, he would say later. Suggestions, such as clearing the odor and the vistula, can be made to the Prince of Baden, but not to me, Napoleon nearly cried out, quite unexpectedly for himself. If you were to give me Petersburg and Moscow, I would not accept these conditions. You say I started the war, and who was the first to join his army? The Emperor Alexander, not I. And you offer me negotiations when I've spent millions while you are in alliance with England, and when your position is bad, you offer me negotiations? What is the goal of your allegiance with England? What has it gained you? He said hurriedly, obviously no longer directing his speech at stating the advantages of concluding a peace and discussing its possibility, but only at proving his rightness and strength, and the wrongs and errors of Alexander. The introduction of his speech was made, obviously, with the aim of bringing out the advantages of his position and showing that, in spite of that, he had accepted the openings of negotiations. But he now began to speak, and the more he spoke, the less he was able to control his speech. The whole aim of his speech now was to obviously exalt himself and insult Alexander, that is, to do the thing that he at least wanted to do at the beginning of the meeting. You say they've concluded a peace with the Turks? Balashov inclined his head affirmatively. Peace has been concluded, he began, but Napoleon did not let him speak. He clearly needed to speak himself, and went on to speak with that eloquence and unrestrained irritation to which spoiled people are so greatly inclined. Yes, I know that they've concluded peace with the Turks without getting Moldavia and Wallachia, and I would have given your sovereign those provinces just as I gave him Finland. Yes, he went on, I promised, and I would have given the Emperor Alexander Moldavia and Wallachia, but now he won't have those beautiful provinces. He might, however, have joined them to his empire, and within one reign he would have expanded Russia from the Gulf of Bothnia to the mouth of the Danube. Catherine the Great couldn't have done more, Napoleon was saying, growing more and more flushed, pacing the room, and repeating to Balashov almost the same words he had spoken to Alexander himself at Tilsit. Tu scelles l'arrêt de mon amitié. Ah, quel beau reine, quel beau reine, he repeated several times, stopped, took a gold snuff box from his pocket, and inhaled greedily through his nose. Quel beau reine aurait fait entrer celui de Emperor Alexander. He glanced at Balashov with pity. Just as Balashov was about to observe something, he again hastily interrupted him. And what could he desire and seek that he could not have found in my friendship? Said Napoleon, with a shrug of perplexity. No, he found it better to surround himself with my enemies. And who are they? He went on. He summoned the Steins, the Armfelts, the Winserods, the Benensigs. Stein, a traitor driven from his fatherland. Armfelt, a debauchee and intriguer. Winsingerode, a fugitive French subject. Benigsen, a bit more of a soldier than the others, but all the same and incompetent, who was unable to do anything in 1807, who must call up terrible memories in the Emperor Alexander. Let's suppose, if we were competent, they could be made use of, Napoleon. Let's suppose if they were competent, they could be made use of, Napoleon went on, barely able to keep up verbally with the constantly emerging considerations showing him his rightness or power, which to his mind were the same. But that is not the case. They're no good either for peace or for war. They say Barclay is more capable than the rest, but I wouldn't say so, judging by his first moves. And what are they doing? What are all of those courtiers doing? Buful proposes, Armfelt argues, Benigsen considers. Barclay, called upon to act, doesn't know what to decide on, and the time passes. Bagration alone is a military man. He's stupid, but he has experience, a good eye, and determination. And what role does your young sovereign play in that outrageous crowd? They compromise him and shift onto him the responsibility for all that's happening. Un souverain ne doit être à l'armée. Quel compte il est général, he said, obviously throwing these words as a challenge into the face of the sovereign. Napoleon knew how much Alexander wished to be a military commander. It's a week since the campaign began, and you failed to defend Vilna. You're cut into two and thrown out of the Polish provinces. Your army murmurs. On the contrary, your majesty, said Balashov, barely managing to remember what had been told him and following with difficulty these verbal fireworks. The troops are burning with desire. I know everything, Napoleon interrupted him. I know everything, and I know the number of your battalions as accurately as my own. You have less than 200,000 men, and I have 3 times that number. I give you my word of honor, said Napoleon, forgetting that his word of honor could have no meaning. I give you ma parole d'honneur que j'ai 5 près 30,000 hommes de ce soir de la Vistule. The Turks are no help to you. They're good for nothing and have proved it by making peace with you. The Swedes, their destiny is ruled by mad kings. Their king was insane. They changed him and took another, Bernadotte, who promptly went out of his mind, because no Swede who wasn't a madman would conclude alliances with Russia. Napoleon grinned spitefully and put his snuff box to his nose. To each of Napoleon's phrases, Balashov could and would have objected. He continually made the movement of a man who wishes to say something, but Napoleon interrupted him. For instance, about the madness of the Swedes. Balashov was about to say that Sweden was an island when Russia backed her, but Napoleon cried out angrily to stifle his voice. Napoleon was in that state of irritation in which a man has to talk and talk and talk, only so as to prove his rightness to himself. It was becoming oppressive for Balashov. As an envoy, he was afraid of losing his dignity and felt it necessary to object. But as a human being, he shrank morally before the oblivion of groundless wrath in which Napoleon obviously found himself. He knew that all the words Napoleon was now saying meant nothing, and that he would be ashamed of them himself once he came to his senses. Balashov stood, his eyes lowered, looking at the movements of Napoleon's fat legs, and tried to avoid his gaze. What do I care about your allies, said Napoleon. I have the Poles for allies. There are 80,000 of them, and they fight like lions, and will be 200,000 of them. And probably becoming still more aroused because in saying that he had said an obvious untruth, and because Balashov, in the same pose of submission to his fate, stood silently before him, he turned around sharply and went up very close to Balashov's face and made energetic and rapid gestures with his white hands, nearly shouting. Know that if you stir up Prussia against me, know that I will wipe her off the map of Europe, he said, with a pale face distorted by anger, beating one small hand against the other with an energetic gesture. Yes, I'll hurl you back beyond the Dvina, beyond Dnieper, and rebuild the barriers against you, which Europe was criminal and blind to have allowed to be destroyed. Yes, that's what will happen to you. That's what you've gained by distancing yourself from me, he said, and silently paced the room several times, his fat shoulders twitching. He put the snuff box into his waistcoat pocket, took it out again, brought it to his nose several times, and stopped facing Balashov. He paused, looking mockingly straight into Balashov's eyes, and said in a quiet voice, Et cependant quel beurre aurait pour avoir votre maître. Balashov, feeling it necessary to object, said that on the Russian side things did not look so gloomy. Napoleon said nothing, went on looking at him mockingly, and obviously was not listening to him. Balashov said that in Russia all sorts of good things were expected from the war. Napoleon nodded condescendingly as if to say, I know it's your duty to say so, but you don't believe it yourself. I've persuaded you. At the end of Balashov's speech, Napoleon again took out his snuff box, snuffed from it, and gave a signal by stamping his foot twice on the floor. The door opened. A respectfully flexing gentleman-in-waiting handed the emperor his hat and gloves. Another handed him a handkerchief. Napoleon, without looking at him, turned to Balashov. Assure the Emperor Alexander on my behalf, he said, taking his hat, that I am as devoted to him as before. I know him perfectly and value his lofty qualities very highly. Je ne vous retiens plus, General. Vous recevrez ma lettre à l'Empereur. And Napoleon quickly went to the door. Everyone in the reception room rushed forward and down the stairs. And that's all for today, friends. I must dash off. But thank you for stopping by. I'm glad we could get a little bit more and interesting the development of Napoleon's character, which seems quite insane. But I guess that's how history has always rather painted him. So definitely rather interesting. We'll see what develops tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye.